It's live now.
It's live. Already?
Yes.
The best thing that happened next time
It's live now.
Oh, you're
Yes, it's live cast.
already recording?
Yeah.
everything got restricted right away. I said, okay.
I think it would be a good idea to bring the table here.
No, but they have slides.
Do they?
I like to walk.
Or a little bit forward, huh?
No, I think it's gonna be like yesterday.
They like to walk on
Yeah.
slides. It's hard to do sit on blue slides.
Yeah.
The bonus was good. Whatever bonus is
Oh my God. We have 15 already.
Oh, people.
50 people.
on paper anyway. Yeah, everybody see you here, see you.
No.
So come over, please.
Yes. Can you ring the bell?
Even other one. There were two phones. You're sitting there. You guys should.
Yeah. Yeah, you can sit there, yes. Please, can you get one more chair there for Partha?
Good afternoon, folks. I think we'll get underway very shortly. Welcome back after a nice coffee break right after the lunch session and so on. It also happens to be the last session too, but even though it was the last session, I think given the background of the panelists that we had, I think it might be a very productive session because they all come with some very unique backgrounds. And yesterday, for example, Fred was talking about industry experience and so on. One of the panelists actually has some industry thing at a very opportune time, which I'll talk about it very shortly. So let me first acknowledge the three panelists. And talking about myself, I'm Khalid Lenar, I'm from McMaster University. And the panelists today are, I'll start from, I'm reading from the back, okay, from the program booklet. We have Professor Subrahmanyam, who goes by the name Subra from UCLA. He's the Golden Irwin Hirsch Chair in Money and Banking. His basic interests are in investor psychology and the exploding field of behavioral finance and economics. And I think a good number of papers now in accounting are feeding off that kind of developments in that area. So we'll try to hear more of what he has to say about that. Then moving on, now forward in the booklet is Professor Kothari, who goes by SP Kothari. He's a Gordon Willett Professor of Accounting and Finance at MIT. And he's the one I was alluding to when I talked about industry experience. He actually happened to be the head of equity research at Barclays. Guess when? 2008, 2009. I'm sure he has something. I don't know if it's in the slides, but I'd be very curious, given what I talked about investor psychology, I'd like to know what was the psychology in the equity research room, as Lehman Brothers went under and other things that happened. And then moving forward into the booklet, okay, as we very own here within our geography here is Professor Mohanram, Partha Mohanram, is the CPO Ontario Professor of Financial Accounting at Rotman here in the same city. And he works again in the areas of financial valuation, and I think he has his own scores, metrics as to how to do certain things. And I'm sure he'll probably be able to say some remarks which might bridge what SP or Subra might have to say. At this point, I think I should probably shut up and sit down and let the panelists take over. So I don't know if you all want to do it in sequence or what, I leave it to the panelists. Partha, you want to start? Because you're sitting in the corner, so you start. Because two of you have some slides, and then, yeah.
Samir is Samir Trabalsi. Trabalsi, you told us an order.
Yeah,
He said
so,
SP, me and Partha.
yes.
So we're going to stick to what he said.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
If that's okay with us.
Okay, that's good, okay.
I never disagree with Samir.
Okay, so for the format, no? Samir said, Trabalsi.
Yeah.
What about the format? 30 in the
30, and people can ask questions.
within the 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And then we'll have like little time at the end for.
And there is another 30 minutes for everybody to ask questions.
Thank you.
I leave it to you.
Samir?
Yeah.
Very informal group.
I think I also have to stand because I'm slides, but SP, what are we comfortable with?
They are going to stand, let me show. But I can stand too. Good afternoon, Samir, thank you to the organizers, and really excited about sharing some of my thoughts here with all of you. I'm going to talk about financial reporting and governance problems. And as we all know, there has been an enormous development of capital markets, shareholder activism, mind-boggling amount of regulation. In fact, that's one thing that everyone all over the world people talk about is there is excessive regulation, it seems. There's also vigorous litigation. A lot of academics are making a good living as expert witnesses. And extensive academic research over the past 4 decades, and still daunting challenges remain in terms of governance as well as reporting issues. And what I'm going to do is talk about a couple of those here with some examples. The recurring phenomena that one comes across are the spectacular failure of governance. We come across many debacles, many reporting frauds, and they demonstrate how governance must have failed. And how can we address what seems to be, in my opinion, this is a structural problem. I mean, every few years there is something spectacular. People starting around, add some regulation, and lo and behold, a few years later, similar thing happens. So it seems to me, and this perhaps goes back to what Subra might say, is behavior of managers. They seem to have a compelling desire to withhold bad news. And this is notwithstanding our witnessing disastrous consequences subsequently in cases where they get caught or when their doubling down strategy unravels. So there's desire to withhold bad news, that is. Second, I also find it strange that many boards seem ineffective and auditors seem to be less than sufficiently skeptical of what management reports are, and that's the sense in which there are audit failures. Finally, there is the corporate lobbying, and that influences financial reporting as well as standard setting and regulation. And those have become the whipping boys in political debates, as we know, especially in the US currently with the presidential elections taking place, and also in the academic research. And the question is, to what extent that is affecting governance and operations, and are there any moderating forces, especially does competition have anything to say about the effects of what one might say is regulatory capture? Okay? So quickly, I'm going to give a couple of examples to illustrate the seriousness of these couple of issues, and then I will hand it over to Subra and Partha Mohanram to continue with the talk. Many of you would be familiar with Valiant Pharmaceutical. Happens to be a Canadian firm. I didn't pick it because I'm coming here. It was something that it so happened. I think most of the action was taking place in the US. It so happens that it is headquartered in Quebec, and the CEO is Michael Pearson, or was Michael Pearson. And it had a 90% decline in stock price. So this was not a chicken feed kind of stock. This was huge. That 90% represented tens of billions of dollars. And in fact, the market cap after the 90% decline was still about $12, $13 billion. So meaning thereby it was a $100 billion plus company. There were many renowned investors, so it wasn't short of some active investors. Bill Ackman and Value Act were among them, or still are among them. So what did Valiant do? Well, Valiant, it was simple model. It used to buy old generic products, and then somehow it was able to negotiate much higher prices and sell them. And my guess is this was coming about because the payer was not a competitive kind of setting, but there was some insurance company or government agency buying medicines on behalf of patients, and therefore Valiant was able to negotiate prices that were high even for those generic drug products. For example, they raised drug prices by 66% in 2015, okay? That is 66% at a time when everything, and these are generic drugs, 5 times more than its closest industry peer. To give you a specific example, I don't know if any of you uses toenail fungus cream. It costs $1,000 for a tube. So that was their best-selling drug. Okay. Many politicians have advocated that regulators should look into the business strategy and should prevent others from following similar. Okay. Valiant, like many other firms, was highly acquisitive, and it borrowed a whole lot. It had $30 billion. It acquired Bausch & Lomb in 2013, paying a 95% premium, and I will come back to why I'm bringing up Bausch & Lomb. Okay? It has low tax environment from Canada, so that's probably one of the reasons why it is headquartered here. And so the way it did business was it had distributors called Philidor and others. Okay? Philidor is a pharmacy that Valiant used to distribute drugs, and Valiant purchased an option to acquire Philidor for $100 million. Okay? Now, one would think that when Valiant's 7% of revenues were accounted for by Philidor, that it would at least disclose this option. It did not. So this is one of those reporting failures. And one wonders how the auditors miss something as basic as that. Valiant subsequently consolidated Philidor's results in its own financial reports. Now, Philidor was not the only subsidiary and distributor. It had many others. Okay? R&O Pharmacy, who turns out to be a customer of Philidor. Okay? But on surface at least, it looks Philidor and R&O were the same. They have the same company and same management. Okay? R&O refers to themselves as Philidor on its website. So it's not just that there was something that was hidden behind anything. Even on the website it was the same. The two companies also have the same toll-free number to call privacy officer. So there were so many similarities. Similarly, Valiant created an entire network of phantom pharmacies. And these were West Wilshire Pharma, Safex Pharma, Orbit Pharma, and all have the same fax number as R&O and Philidor. So that's the sense in which it's not just that in substance it was same, even in appearance it was the same, and therefore one would think that these things would be picked up by in some governance issue, either by the board or by auditors. Okay. In February 2016, questions surfaced over the legitimacy of Valiant's accounting practices that were masking questionable operating practices. There was an allegation of fraud because they were creating invoices to deceive the auditors and booking revenue. Vast majority of the accounting frauds are rooted in phantom revenues, okay? And this is no exception. Once that thing came to notice, Valiant did acknowledge that it booked revenues when the company delivered drugs to Philidor. So that means this was intra-firm distribution rather than a sale to end user, and still Valiant was booking revenues on its financial statements. It was $58 million of revenue, so that may not be a whole lot compared to the business, but it alerts auditors, investors, and others about the seriousness of the issue. Okay? Now, I said that Bosch and Lomb, I will make the connection. Well, guess what? What did Bosch and Lomb about 15 years ago? I was in Rochester, so I know a little more about Bosch and Lomb than many others might. But Bosch and Lomb also was caught doing exact same thing. So here is Valiant acquires Bosch and Lomb and then engages in the same practice for which Bosch and Lomb got into huge trouble, and finally it had to sell itself to Valiant. Okay? So this happened in 1993. They had overstated revenue by $42 million and net income by $17 million. Bosch and Lomb, this is in 1993. And as I said, Bosch and Lomb was acquired by Valiant in 2013, 20 years later, and history repeats itself. So, naturally, once these things were disclosed, what really hit the valuation of Valiant was that it could not continue to sell generic products at inflated prices. So what was capitalized in the valuation of about $130 billion of Valiant stock price was the fact that this firm might be able to continue to earn high margins on its sales of drugs. Once this got discovered, now this is the tip of the iceberg that got discovered, right? Revenue inflation of $58 million or some such amount. But the real news was that the profit margin is going to plummet because the kind of high prices that Valiant was charging, that wouldn't be possible. And once that business model crumbled, the stock price came down crashing, and what we find is that it lost about 90% of its valuation. Here, PwC was the auditor. And of course, now there are lawsuits about how Valiant failed to disclose information on a timely basis, and that those legal things will continue for next several years. But reality is, this is an example of really spectacular failure of both auditing and governance. Okay? Let me give. How am I on time? Okay, so. Let me give you one more example, and Theranos. Right? Theranos, this is founded by Elizabeth Holmes, chairman and CEO of this private corporation. Okay? Its valuation, within a matter of few years that she started this company, the valuation ended up being about $8 billion. So this is not chump change, but it is a very substantial valuation. Sunny Balwani was the president and chief operating officer of this particular firm. Okay. Now, what does Theranos do? It has been, for the last several months, it has been in news. It's a blood testing laboratory. In a matter of few years, as I said, its valuation reached $8 billion. And currently, it's an embattled Silicon Valley firm, although it's not the traditional Silicon Valley firm in the sense that it's nothing to do with silicons as much as to blood testing. Nonetheless, it was one of those spectacular success stories in the biotech area. Securities and Exchange Commission and U.S. Attorney in San Francisco are investigating, and this firm is in deep trouble. Okay? Theranos has acknowledged that the blood tests for past 2 years are unreliable or faulty. So this is, the whole foundation of this firm was on faulty tests. And now you might ask, for this firm that became $8 billion, okay, what was its board like? So to give you some idea about the governance, you would be flabbergasted to learn what the board is. Okay, at least I was. Of course, the chairman and CEO, Elizabeth Holmes herself, she was on the board. She founded Theranos in 2003 and to shift America's healthcare paradigm from one focused on reactive care to one in which early detection and prevention become a reality. This almost sounds like CSR, right? You know, it was very lofty goal, and we ought to admire her for that. On the other hand, what we do not want to admire is that there was, rather than substance, there was some flaws lurking underneath. She left Stanford University. It seems to me that I think, you know, none of us here has any chance of becoming very successful because we didn't leave graduate school midway through. I think that's the first mistake we all have done, because she, like Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, she also left undergrad midway through Stanford University School of Engineering to build Theranos, and she succeeded in that. Okay. All right. Sunny Balwani, president and CEO, he was director. He was an entrepreneur and computer scientist. So now you would think that this blood test kind of firm, why would a computer and scientist? Okay? Now, Sunny joined Theranos after dropping out of the computer science program at Stanford University. So basically, they met when they were students. He had some prior experience, and I will talk about that, but basically they met there, and next thing you know, he becomes COO of this firm. Sunny began his career at Lotus Development Corporation, after which he served in Microsoft in various roles and later started his own company. So he was an entrepreneur. So he had no technical background in the sense of no scientific technical background. Well, it is scientific. He had scientific and technical, but nothing to do with the medical field or biology or those. Bechtel, Riley Bechtel was a director. Bechtel is chairman of the board and director of Bechtel Group, which is a huge construction and some other businesses. David Boyce, you might ask who is David Boyce. David Boyce is an internationally recognized, he's a celebrated lawyer. Very impressive guy. It so happens I have worked with him and I know him, but an extraordinarily impressive guy. He's among many high-profile things. His most recent was that he served as co-lead counsel for the plaintiffs in Perry versus Brown, which established the first time federal constitutional right for gay and lesbian citizens to marry. So that's the sense in which he has done in corporate securities litigation and other social purposes also litigation. Very high-profile, extraordinarily successful lawyer. William Foch, he is an epidemiologist and former director of U.S. Center for Disease Control. He is a Presidential Medal of Freedom winner, awardee. Okay. William Frist, Bill Frist, he's a nationally recognized heart and lung transplant surgeon. He was U.S. Senate Majority Leader. I mean, this is enormous accomplishment. Henry Kissinger was on the board. Okay. Richard Kovovich, he served as Chief Executive Officer of Wells Fargo. So this is Wells Fargo, same firm that is in news these days, but nonetheless, this guy is a super accomplished individual. James Mattis is retired United States Marine Corps General. Okay, he served as the 11th Commander of United States Central Command. So, Sam Nunn has served as Senator for 24 years. He is the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Bill Perry, he is the former Defense Secretary of United States. Okay. Gary Ruffhead, he was Navy Admiral. George Shultz, apart from being an academic, he was Dean of University of Chicago when Ray Ball and Ross Watts were students there. But he had 4 federal cabinet positions. And then he was also president of a major engineering and construction company. So take a look at all of these guys. Now, makes you wonder why they would accept to be on the board of this firm. Very few of them had any medical background. It's hard to imagine that they could ask any technical questions to Elizabeth Holmes or Sunny Balwani. And right under their nose, all this fraud was taking place. And this thing, the whole thing kind of unraveled. Just a couple of days ago, Elizabeth Theranos agreed not to conduct any more blood tests. So that whole $8 billion, that has become house of cards, basically. So, on the other hand, on paper it would be one of the most distinguished boards. Okay? All right. So now I'm coming to the last set of. This is not quite an example. This is coming out of the financial crisis, and this is about now. What is it that we always say when corporations they lobby? Right? This goes back to Stigler talking about lobbying and regulatory capture. So the idea is that managers lobby so that they would have favorable regulatory environment and they are able to extract rent. That's the whole idea. That's the whole rent extractive activity, and that's why it's called regulatory capture, or regulatory capture means that firms have successfully engaged in rent extractive activities. Naturally, we tend to blame corporate leadership, and in terms of, this is open season politics right now, and Senator Elizabeth Warren or others, they have been berating corporate leadership for precisely this kind of regulatory capture, if you will. Okay. The question I ask is that what happens in competition? Okay. So let us take the part of the financial crisis activity, and there banks are blamed. And surely I'm not carrying any brief for banks, okay? And they lobbied for lax regulation. They lobbied for their ability to lend without too much documentation, okay? So that is perfectly, it's true that, as I said, they might be at blame. But let us ask, in terms of that regulatory capture, what did the banks do thereafter? They were competing with each other. If you, as an individual borrower, went to the bank, you received cutthroat interest rates. At that time, and the same thing is true now. So the point is that even if lobbying, that is a rent extractive activity, the question is, in competition, would the firms be able to retain that rent? Or in competition, will that rent be passed on to consumers? So this is still, the transfer is from, if there is some rent extractive activity in the first place, the transfer is from the tax revenue that otherwise would have been collected and benefited certain group of individuals. Instead of that, it gets passed on to the consumers of the firms that have lobbied, and their product prices now are offered at lower prices. And if you think about in financial crisis, this is exactly what happened, right? What happened was that the banks lobbied for lax regulation. Interest rates were whatever they were, but many people were able to borrow, regardless of whether they were credit worthy or not, at rates that reflected far less than the level of risk that those borrowers were. Now, why were the banks doing that? Well, they were not using their own money. They were going to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who had given a blank check in terms of buying those loans. So the way the banks made money, at least to a large extent in this might not be the entire story, but to the extent that lobbying and rent extractive activity goes, what happened was that the banks competed with each other and passed on this benefit to consumers. And who lost was taxpayers ultimately. And then those who invested in some of these, maybe they're some of the rich people who might have invested, or some of the mortgages that were held by pension funds or others, they also lost money. But the point is the banks were not able to retain that, the benefit that was being passed on to consumers, right? So that's the sense in which in competition, this is what you will find. In competition, rent extractive activity on part of firms will transfer some wealth, but that wealth is not necessarily transferred to the corporation. So what is the lesson from this activity or this story? The lesson is that if there is lobbying, what the government, what the Justice Department ought to be focused on is there competition in the industry or not. Okay. If competition is ensured, then at least we know the firms won't be able to retain the benefit from the rent extractive activity. Okay. And consumers will benefit. Now you might still ask, as the Justice Department or the government or politicians, they can ask whether that is an optimal outcome or not, and therefore should they succumb to the changes in regulation that really favor consumers, even though the mouthpiece for that regulation or regulatory capture might be corporate leadership. Okay. Now, of course, to the extent that the amount of business that corporations are able to do, because the prices are lower now for the consumers, and this is what happened during the financial crisis, that they were able to do a lot more business, and that would generate income. So that happens now. During the financial crisis, the housing, that was an extreme example of what happened, but in many other cases, the growth in business might be modest as a result of that, but firms are unlikely to be able to retain that rent extraction so long as there is competition. If there isn't competition, then of course we need to worry about it. Okay? Rashad, I know.
Well, I probably would take an issue as to whether banks pass that gain to consumers. They retain most of it.
No, they did.
Yes, they did.
Yes.
Yeah, they borrow at zero and charge 29% interest rate to credit cards and others, and that they still end up being the beneficiary. Consumer.
But that is, so credit card, and we can get into that. Where they charge 29%, the default rates are also pretty high. But that apart, like mortgages, you tell me who would have gotten with no income, no employment data or anything at 2 or 3% interest rate during that time.
That's not to the consumer. That's to the consumer.
Well, I understand there is predatory and those kinds of arguments, but the point is that the banks did not retain it. What the banks were doing, and even now, look at student loans. Now, we might say that the student loans are to the detriment of students. You can say that, whatever. But the point is, the banks are offering at very cheap rates loans, because they say that, well, it's the government who is on the hook, and they are the ones who are easy credit with very lofty ideal or goal or objective of promoting education and benefiting. But the intermediary, so long as it is competing with each other, has no choice but to pass on the benefit to. We will have to concoct a story where there is some extreme collusion here among the competitive firms. And what I'm saying is that is extraordinarily difficult to pull it off, number one. Number two, I don't think there is as much evidence of that.
I think I need a day with you.
Well, that might be good for you, but think about me, you know. Yes.
So just to understand what you're saying, are you saying that we really don't need to worry about governance, and all we have to worry about is there's competition in industry?
No, I'm not. The first two examples were about governance. Even in competition, there can be few individuals or few people who might be engaging in mischief, and we certainly want governance, better governance. To me, after looking at all the events, a bit disappointed in the auditing industry in terms of what they say as watchdogs of some sort. So it seems to me that they are willing to sign off on pretty much anything. It seems that way. I mean, it may be that they do catch a lot of things that we see, and these are few examples where something has kind of slipped by them, but it's possible that it's happening. But to me, it seems that they are a little bit lax in terms of upholding their responsibilities. Now, this might be a difficult, challenging issue. It might be easy for me to say that they should do that, but that's the observation at least I come away with. Yeah. How are we on time?
Yeah, we got 4 minutes to go.
Okay. Oh, you decide. You're the moderator.
No,
you
no,
can.
You're the boss.
Yeah.
I just want to reflect on the point that Professor Rashad mentioned with regard to the bank. Try to differentiate between the shareholder of the banks and the customer of the banks.
Sure.
The banks during the crisis, of course, I could buy, it's an empirical question whether competition could serve to mitigate, lobbying and other activity. However, what I'm talking about, what's happened, the bank engaged in market-making activity, taking the deposit, from their own customer and use it to engage in risky, activity, which is basically hit you, when tell you will lose. So the shareholder benefit, but the taxpayer pay the price.
You're right. But that has nothing to do with the lobbying. At least I don't see that. You're absolutely right. And that, this is the too big to fail, and the banks engaging in leverage activity, and that leading to they being bailed out, although every penny has been paid out. But that beside the point, and in fact the government made a lot of money. But that aside, but that's a separate issue. What I'm saying is that they pay a competitive deposit rate when they are competing, and they charge a competitive rate to customers when they are lending because of competition. They don't have a choice, okay? They don't have a choice. And other industries, this might become even clearer. So that's the sense in which I'm not condoning lobbying, I'm not, this, but all I'm trying to say here is that even if there is lobbying, and what might appear to be rent extractive, it is naive to assume that all of that rent these firms are able to retain. They will have to be extraordinarily smart in the face of competition that they can retain the rent, whatever they have extracted. So that's the sense, that's the point I'm trying to make here.
Do you want to distinguish between, when you use the word competition, between atomistic competition and perfect competition, where you think things will go on, versus there's a friction when you talk about oligopolistic type competition, which is what the banking industry is characterized. Because when you talk about, competing on the mortgage rates and so on, yes, they are competing on that, but behind the mortgage rate is all the structure of the mortgage itself, where there could be all kinds of ways in which they collect fees and mortgage. I don't know how to address that.
Okay, good point. First, at a conceptual level, of course, if it is less than perfectly competitive, not in a trivial sense, but in a substantive sense, Of course, then that's the first point that I would make is that Justice Department ought to channel its energies more on ensuring that there is competition. Because that will at least ensure that the rent is not retained, even if it is extracted. Then they can focus on, do you want the rent that gets extracted and passed on to consumers? Do you like that transfer? But the problem is somewhere else. Because now the taxpayers versus the consumers, they may not be. You see, if rent was not extracted, more tax revenue perhaps would be collected by the government, right? And that, the beneficiaries of that, is that population same as if the rent is extracted and passed on to consumers, the consumer group. And the two might not be similar. So I'm not saying that there isn't a problem, but the problem is of a different nature. Here I'm saying the diagnosis has to be right. Getting back to your point, I think different people might have somewhat different views, and there are 10,000 banks in the US. Now, sure, there are some large banks, and much of the evidence suggests that 3 or 4 competitors make it more or less competitive. And now, number of banks certainly is much more than that. And then there is the foreign banks also, who have pretty decent access. They don't have as good access, of course, this is slightly controlled. But I don't want to get into and make this entire thing only about banking. It's a general point that I want to make. Once again, thank you for sharing some of my ideas with you, and on to other speakers. Thank you.
Okay, I need this back. No picture, please. So can anyone help me, or should I just not use it? Yes. Subelsi, get up. Look. What are you doing?
He knows.
Does he know? Oh, okay.
He's taking a video of technical glitch.
Okay, thank you. This one. This one.
I think that you have one. So, that's the one.
So, project this one. Yes, this one. Thank you very much. This one. Thank you.
We'll come in.
Well, I can't, sorry, I just cannot start till that actually comes out. Do it up. Input
Yeah,
select.
yeah. No, it's there.
How do I start the presentation? From menu seems to. How do you make it a presentation?
Can you hold this? Can you hold this?
Is it PowerPoint or PDF?
It's PowerPoint. It's a PowerPoint slide. I don't
It
understand
says
why.
Keynote. Is it an Apple? It is done in
No,
Apple?
it's a PowerPoint slideshow. That's not going to make any difference. That's that's not the point. The menu for PowerPoint seems different. There we go. Now we go. Slideshow.
Just go to view and
Just go up. Slide. No, go back. Get that menu back.
just go to view and
So how many accountants does it take to get a PowerPoint screen?
go to view.
No, stop.
Just don't you
Stop.
go back to where you were at.
Get that menu back where you were.
Your time is up now.
Let's get the right one.
Yeah.
Let's close the.
This one.
No, this is yours, right?
Please.
Let's get it right.
Fine. Now just go to slideshow. Go slideshow. I know you know, but Samir doesn't.
View. There you go.
Thank you, Mark.
But it's not doing it full screen, right?
No.
Just don't talk about it. It's fine. Okay.
Sorry about the confusion. Anyway, so abstracting away from SP's insightful take, I never realized that you could view regulatory capture that way, that the rents are passed to consumers. So I learned something new from that. Whether we agree with that idea or not, it's certainly seen something that we haven't thought of. Nonetheless, my talk is something totally different. It's going to be more academic in nature, and I'm going to talk about capital market anomalies, which SP has worked on, Partha has worked on, and many of us might probably be interested in, right? I've worked in this area from a theoretical as well as empirical standpoint. So what I'm going to do is to give you my views on how the literature seems to be a bit confused and has been led astray in some sense in thinking about this particular topic. Now, as we know, an anomaly in English is simply a story where you can't explain something, it's something odd or peculiar. And in finance and accounting, we typically think of an anomaly as something that cannot be explained by standard models. Right? I'm going to argue that the anomalies that we actually see in the data in financial markets, in some sense, are arising from a certain source, but the literature is trying really hard to attribute it to some other source, and I would argue that it's being done in a way that seems to be confusing many of us, and that is probably not a desirable outcome for the profession. Those are my views, at least. So if you go with this, then let me first propose to you that if anomalies are things that cannot be explained by standard risk-reward models, what are the standard risk-reward models, right? So while you can't see this very well, everyone who's in accounting or finance understands that the risk-reward models have to be one of two types, both of which are based on covariance risk, right? So the CAPM says that the expected return on a stock is some intercept plus beta times the premium on the market, and the arbitrage pricing theory says that the expected return is risk-free rate plus a risk premium, where the risk premium is a linear combination of factor premiums on a set of macroeconomic factors. These are the quantitative statements of the risk-based benchmark that we evaluate the anomalies with respect to. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to define some well-known anomalies. I'm going to argue if they can be explained by basic risk-reward models. Research and anomalies shed light on whether they can be explained, and talk about what needs to be done. That is the outline of what I'm going to do. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to do is to just review a list of the old anomalies. Like, these things have been around for a long time, and many of us in accounting and finance are extremely familiar with them, so I don't want to waste too much time on them, but it's just things like value anomaly, size anomaly, momentum, where past 12-month returns predict future 12-month returns or in a positive way, monthly reversals, prices up this much, down this month, down next month. Cross-sectionally, the return reversals, high returns predict low returns next month. Accounting accruals, we're familiar with that. Accounting surprises, we're also familiar with that. Another one in finance is idiosyncratic volatility, which is non-systematic volatility has a negative impact on future returns, which is a very big puzzle. You would expect the opposite. With the lack of portfolio diversification, we should expect the reverse result, but we don't see that result. So The research questions that old set of anomalies raises, we'll add to that a new set of anomalies, are essentially, do they vary over time is a question that we might be interested in, right? And trying to understand why they arise. One thing would be that do they vary in a dynamic way. The second thing would be that are they due to missing risk factors or mispricing, right? Are we missing some APT factors? Is it mispricing? The third one is that if it is in fact mispricing, then why are they arising? For example, who's causing them? And if they do exist because of mispricing, then clearly there's an incentive for other agents to arbitrage them, so who's arbitraging them? So these are questions that are legitimate and important to answer if we want to understand stock markets and financial markets in general. Okay, so this is just a slide that really you don't have to see. I'm just telling you the econometric procedure that we use to identify these anomalies. And since this is a generalist talk, I'm going to keep this exposition relatively simple. So the way to analyze these anomalies is to simply run monthly regressions with the returns on the left-hand side and the anomalies on the right-hand side. And you run them monthly cross-sectionally. And then you average out the coefficients on these anomaly variables and then see if the average coefficient is different from zero in a statistical sense. And we call that form of Beth regressions. That's typically the way that we do it. Another way to document them, and this is something that's familiar to many of us who actually work in anomalies, but for those of us who don't, just think of it as a regression analysis. Right? Another way to do it is to sort stocks into portfolios based on the variable of interest. For example, if it's momentum, sort stocks based on past momentum, and then take a long position in stocks with highest momentum, a short position in the stocks with lowest momentum, and see if the hedge portfolio turns out positive and statistically significant from zero. So that's a second way to test these anomalies, to test if the anomalies exist. Now, before we proceed to any regression analysis and any perspective on anomalies and why they arise, let me give you a table from a paper that was published in 1996, which I don't think gets the play it deserves. But when I show it to my students, they just love it. And not surprisingly, because they all want to make money, but let's just talk about this paper, which was published in the Journal of Financial Economics, published in Rochester. So what they basically do is do a kitchen sink approach and try to identify the variables that are the most significant predictors of equity returns. Now, we teach our students that markets are weak form efficient. We teach our students that markets, if they did exhibit arbitrage opportunities, we'll see them arbitraged away. And so they shouldn't exist or should exist only for a fleeting time period. Well, if we think that, then the evidence should support the notion that markets are weak form efficient, right? And as you know, weak form efficiency is that there's no memory in stock prices, right? And in a basic textbook, right? There's no memory in stock prices. So in other words, you can't predict the future from the past. What these guys showed, and they were slammed for data mining, we'll come back to that in a minute. What these guys showed is that the top 4 most important predictors of stock returns in the United States are actually technical variables. So the most important predictor of returns is 1-month return with a t-stat of -17. The second most is momentum with a t-stat of 7. The third most is trading volume, another technical indicator with a t-stat of -5. And the fourth one is 2-month return with a t-stat of -5 as well. If the top most important predictors of returns in the US are technical variables, then in what sense is the market weak form efficient? This paper is obscure. Nobody ever talks about it. Why not? Isn't this an important result? Where did this paper go? Why don't we talk about this paper? We don't, because people say it's data mining. Well, let me tell you why it isn't data mining. Because when you split the sample into the first half and the second half, the variables that are important in the first half are pretty much the same as the variables important in the second half. So when you split the table in half, a sample period in half, the results are similar. They're not different. So if it was data mining, then how come we have consistency in the predictors? So that's food for thought. There are about 45 variables in the kitchen sink approach. And the first 4 are technical. The next few are things like, what evaluation ratios, like very familiar ones like earnings to price, ROE, and book to price. And EP, BM are well known to accountants and finance people. And return on equity actually has a positive coefficient, so highly profitable firms earn higher returns in the future. We'll come back to whether that's consistent with risk pricing or not a bit later. But before we get into that, it's a little bit hard to argue that the top 4 variables which are technical have much to do with risk pricing. Really? I mean, how are you going to justify that? You could justify each one of these variables by alluding to risk-based arguments. But top 4, all of them past returns or volume, that's a little bit hard to fathom as to why that would be risk pricing. So I want to start with this. This is my starting point. I'm going to build on this a little bit, but I want you to keep that in mind. And if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me. Yes?
Who are you guys?
Huh?
Which paper is this?
It's a paper by Robert Haugen and Baker. I don't know the first name. 1996 JFE. 1996 JFE.
Subrat, you know, I know they replicated within the sample, but if have people followed up and do these
Okay, so I'm going to tell you that in just, okay, I can tell you that now actually. But first, let me alert you to the notion that to avoid that accusation that they mined the data, they simply split the sample up and did it separately first and second half. And the list is fairly similar, not identical, but the list ranking is fairly monotonic. If you look at the p-stat, decreasing order of p-stat, it's fairly similar, not identical, but fairly similar. So I thought that what I would do with one of my colleagues, Amit Goyal, who is also UCLA grad, we thought that this is so interesting, that we would replicate this out of sample. So they ended it in 93, so we repeated this study from 94 to 2015. I have this in my inbox, I don't have it here, but here's the result of that. The list is correlation of 0.7. So if you simply do a rank correlation in the variables important from 79 to 93, 94 to 15, the rank correlation in the list is about 0.7, right? The rank means that 1, 2, 3, 4, you know. The profits have been halved. So whatever money they document they make on this list is about half now, right? Which is not surprising. We all know that people like Bartley are doing this kind of stuff, right? So it's not surprising it's half, but it is still statistically significant. So if you replicate this, you get similar results out of sample as well. So that's the result that we have at the moment. Any other questions? Okay, so if you don't have any further queries, let me just move on and talk more about a few other anomalies that we've recently discovered that puzzle us even more. Not even more, but also continue to puzzle us. So I'm going to focus on 2 of them. The first one is that asset growth negatively predicts returns. We'll give you a graph of that. And the second one is that profitable firms, as measured by gross margin, which is an extremely trivial quantity, sales minus cost of goods sold over assets, that variable positively predicts returns. And again, we're left with the issue that why would these variables predict returns? We'll come back to that in a bit. But another puzzle that these anomalies create is that it seems like the asset growth represents overreaction, and the profitability results present underreaction, because high firms with high profit margins earn high returns, and firms with high asset growth earn low returns. The graphical way to present asset growth is that if you simply sort stocks based on a simple number, delta A over A, annually, and accounting for the fiscal year end, take a position for the next 12 months in those stocks, this is the graph of what you earn. So this dotted line is low asset growth firms. This dotted line is high asset growth firms. And the really dark black line is the hedge portfolio, 1 minus 10. So you can see that the 1 minus 10 portfolio, we go long on firms with low asset growth and high on firms with, long on firms with high asset growth and short on firms with low asset growth. Sorry, the other way around. Long on firms with low asset growth, short on firms with high asset growth. Your average annual return is about 20% per year, which is a huge number that these guys document in the Journal of Finance paper. A little bit hard to argue that that could be the case, why that could be the case. So we'll come back to whether this would be a rational explanation in just a bit. But before we get into that, let me present to you the profitability result, presented in a slightly different way. So the profitability result was documented by Robert Doby Marks, a Rochester professor, in JFE, right? Very, in my view, important paper. The profitability results can be documented by a very simple notion: sort firms by profit margin. The profit margin is simply sales minus COGS over assets. That's it. That's all you need to know to calculate profitability. Sort firms into 10 groups, deciles, take a long position in group 10, short position in group 1, and the Sharpe ratio is what's plotted here. So the guy's point, Logan Marx's point, is that profitability and value are counter-cyclical. So if you do a book market-based strategy and a profitability-based strategy, it's counter-cyclical. So when profit makes money, value loses money, and vice versa. So if you do a 50-50 mix, your Sharpe ratio is amazing. That's the Sharpe ratio for a 50-50 mix, this dark black line. So he says, obviously, profitability works. Now, my question is, well, so what the heck is going on in these amazing profits that you earn from these strategies? First, you could replicate it for other countries like China. You get similar results. Asset growth has been replicated in a large number of countries. You get similar results. Now, what could be a rational reason? So, let me give you some rational reasons that have been proposed without getting into the papers themselves. So, Lu Zhang, obviously, is very high on rationality. So, his argument for asset growth is the following. If a firm has high asset growth, right, it earns low returns, right? Why does it earn low returns? It's because it has low discount rates. That's why it has high asset growth. So you're going to invest more when your cost of capital is low, right? So you're going to have high asset growth when your discount rate is low. And what the future returns are reflecting is simply the low cost of capital, right? Which is a very reasonable explanation. Can't argue with that. But whether that explanation will permit a 20% annual return is a problem, right? You can't calibrate it very well. And arguing that that's the case requires to give more evidence than just assert that this is in fact what's going on. Nonetheless, that's a candidate explanation. Assuming we accept that explanation, that firms with high asset growth are investing more because they have lower costs of capital, and so that's manifested in low rates of return, we still have to explain why firms with high profitability earn high returns. So are we trying to then say that firms with high profitability have high discount rates? Well, maybe they do, but if you try to fit everything into the discount rate mode, you get into the realm that, oh my goodness, this doesn't seem plausible, right? This would require a great contortion to then argue that if we accept this, then this is basically saying that highly profitable firms have high discount rates. Really? If you have a high profit margin, you have a higher cost of capital? You could argue that, but I don't think common sense would suggest that that would be the case, right? So we're left with a situation where to rationalize both is a little bit hard, I think, right? So that's something that the literature needs to think about much more carefully before proposing that everything fits into the rational paradigm. Okay, I'm going to give you a few more results on anomalies that to try and convince ourselves that look, trying to fit everything into risk-based approaches is not really particularly useful, but nonetheless, we'll talk more about that later. So let me give you a few more results on anomalies, which sort of consistent with my position that these things reflect investor biases, and we need to understand these biases much better by way of future research. So one of the papers that was published in JAE basically says that anomalies have declined, profits have declined over time. So if you take a look at, for example, the returns on the size-based anomaly, monthly reversals, momentum, idiosyncratic volatility, earnings surprises, all of these anomaly profits have declined over time, right? It so turns out that you could link it to the growth of hedge funds. So you could say that profitability of the anomalies essentially can be linked in the time series to hedge fund asset under management. So shocks to asset under management, positive shocks to asset under management, have a negative impact on the anomaly profits, which means that the growth of the hedge fund industry has had an impact on attenuating the profits from these anomalies. That was the main point of the paper. But the results are fairly consistent, and the profitability of most anomalies have declined over time, and this could be consistent with the notion that it's very difficult for equity hedge funds to make money these days, right? Everyone's doing the same thing, arbitraging the same anomalies. But what does that actually tell us? That's the question. So does that tell us the market's efficient? Does that tell us that the equity markets are priced rationally? I would argue it actually tells us the opposite. If the anomalies are risk-related, then how come they decline over time? I mean, why in the world would the risk preference shift? So as the hedge fund industry has grown, as markets have become more liquid and actively traded, risk preferences have also changed in a manner that they become risk neutral, or what's going on? So my point here is that the fact that the anomaly profits are not stationary and decline over time consistently actually suggests that the reason they arose in the first place was because of improperly formed expectations on the part of the investing public. Because if they're rationally formed, they should be stationary over time. Have we all become risk neutral? Right? That would be required to explain this, right? We've all become risk neutral. Why in the world would we suddenly become risk neutral? If anything, we should have become more risk averse because of all the financial crisis and all these things. So, to fit this result into a way of thinking that seems consistent with what makes sense, to me at least, is that they arose because of Bass beliefs in the first place, and the fact that there was so much capital devoted to arbitraging them attenuated the profits, right? So that's the way I would say. So while it is true that it's hard to make money on them, money you can make on them isn't zero, but it's harder to make money. If you're trying to understand why they arose, this supports the notion they arise because people make mistakes, not because people are rational and they're pricing risk. It's not consistent with that, right? That's what I would argue. Another thing that's interesting in a paper published by me and my co-author on the JFE recently is the issue of who causes the anomalies and who arbitrages them. So the arbitrage approach would suggest that hedge funds would arbitrage these anomalies, and who might cause them? Well, two culprits are mutual funds and individual investors. Individual investors are obvious, I mean, like they make mistakes. We kind of know that, right? That's not surprising. But because of incentive issues, the literature has proposed that mutual funds also make mistakes, and that's because the incentives aren't properly aligned. They're not compensated based on a very sophisticated clientele. They cater to retail investors. So the money they attract might be more due to marketing than actually having incentives because of 220 and other things to arbitrage. Based on those observations, we could argue that mutual funds are less sophisticated than hedge funds, and it should be hedge funds that are arbitraging the anomalies. So this particular graph, the axes are hard to read, but let me tell you all that it's saying in this JFE paper published last year. All it's saying is the following. When hedge fund floors are high, anomaly profits are low. When mutual fund flows are high, anomaly profits are high. So when the mutual fund industry is getting a lot of money from outside investors, the anomaly profits are high, right? So in the time series, periods of high mutual fund flows cause an increase in anomaly profits. And periods in which hedge fund flows are high cause a decrease in anomaly profits. This result, which is in this graph is presented by quintiles. So quintiles of fund flows, mutual funds and hedge funds, and the fact that they go in opposite directions. All that's saying is when mutual fund flows are high, they fall in the highest quintile, anomaly profits are high. And when hedge fund flows are high, they fall in the highest quintile, anomaly profits are low. That's all this is. So that's sort of consistent with my observation that hedge funds arbitrage and mutual funds cause them. This picture, again, is consistent more with the notion that mutual funds make mistakes and hedge funds fix them, rather than with the picture that the anomalies arise because of risk pricing. Because if that's the case, why do they vary with mutual fund flows and hedge fund flows in a manner consistent with mispricing, right? So again, this picture is a little bit hard to rationalize with the notion that these anomalies arise because of risk pricing. Okay, so that's the next item on the agenda. Another interesting result about these anomaly profits is that anomalies are stronger during periods of high sentiment. So let me explain what that means. Okay, so first of all, the first objection is, no matter what measure of investor sentiment you give me, I could always argue that that's a measure of risk preference, right? So when people are risk averse, they're cautious. When people are risk seeking, they're excited. So you could sort of link it in some way to risk preferences. However, the first point to note is that the sentiment measures we actually use in the finance literature are orthogonalized with respect to business cycle variables. So they're not dependent on the business cycle, right? So it's kind of orthogonalized with respect to the usual culprits. So the sentiment is not capturing some fluctuations in the macro environment. That's ruled out. If we rule that out, let me now get to the next point. Generally speaking, risk pricing arises because of risk aversion, right? So we kind of averse to risk, and so we price risk. If we were all risk neutral, all factor models go out the window. Expected returns equal to risk-free rate, right? So we have to be risk averse for risk to be priced. And in addition to that, we have to, the more risk averse we are, according to the risk hypothesis, the more anomaly profits there should be because the more aggressive risk is being priced when people are more risk averse. Right? As I said, if people are risk neutral, expected returns equal to risk-free rate according to the rational parameter. So this would suggest that if sentiment measures that we have are capturing risk, periods of high sentiment, people are really emotional, should be accompanied by, when people are positively inclined, they're supposed to be less risk averse, right? So if you're positively inclined, excited, happy, you're more excited about investing in the stock market, you're less risk averse. So we should see anomaly profits being actually low when people are high sentiment, because they're really positive emotions, less risk averse. But that's not what we see. We see the opposite. Anomaly profits are high during periods of high sentiment. Now, if high sentiment is positive emotion, as the behavioral people would tell us, that should be less risk averse, and the anomaly profit should be low, but we see the opposite. So that, again, seems to be consistent with people making mistakes. It doesn't seem to be consistent with risk-based pricing. Okay, so this particular graph is impossible to read, but let me tell you the economic story behind this paper by Stanbaugh, Yu, and Young. So what these guys show, is that they have 11 anomalies, and what they show is anomaly profits are highest during high sentiment periods. How do we measure high sentiment? Well, what we do is that we take the time series of number of IPOs issued, trading volume, and volume of equity issued by management, and a few other vectors, right? And we do a principal component analysis. We extract the first component, that's the sentiment measure, then we orthogonalize that sentiment measure with respect to macro variables. What's the logic? Sentiment is high when there's a lot of IPO issuance, right? Managers issue a lot of, take more firms public when people have positive emotions. When SEOs, when people, managers issue more shares to the public in general, and when people have positive inclinations, and trading volume is high when people are positively inclined. So based on this, you can sort of extract the first PCA from volume, IPO, share issuance, and then orthogonalize it with respect to macro variables. Periods of high sentiment are periods where the sentiment measure is bigger than its time series median, and vice versa. So when sentiment is higher than its time series median, it's positive sentiment, otherwise negative sentiment. What SYY, these guys show, is that anomaly profits are higher during high sentiment periods, and the profits on the short side of anomalies are higher during high sentiment periods. Which means that people are overpricing stocks when they have positive emotions, right? That's the logic that they would draw. So again, the notion that anomaly profits are higher when people have positive emotions suggests that people just get excited and overprice stocks in that time period, given the additional evidence that the short side of the anomalies yield higher profits when sentiment is high, right? This is a little bit hard to justify in the context of a risk-based model. So that's another piece of evidence that we could take away. So if anomalies are, due to risk misspecification, why are they stronger during high sentiment periods? Okay, so I'm coming to the end of my portion of the presentation, but just a few more slides. So we find the following. Anomaly profits decrease over time. Anomalies vary with sentiment in the sense that anomaly profits are higher when sentiment is high. And anomaly profits are related to hedge fund flows, and hedge funds actively arbitrage anomalies. So in sum, I would argue that the evidence indicates that the anomalies actually do not capture risk pricing, because, as I said, I gave you a number of arguments why that it will be very hard to fit the picture into a risk pricing story. So I would argue that the policy implications of this are important, and the policy implications, in my view, society is better off if it recognizes the fact that investors make mistakes. If we don't recognize that, I think we would do society a disservice. Because we go with the school of thought that everything can be fitted into a factor model, and you get an anomaly, you build a factor from it, like a profitability factor, an asset growth factor, a book-to-market factor. We're really doing society a disservice, because if people make mistakes and we don't incorporate that into policy making, that's just bad for society. And so I'd say for the following. If you want an efficient market, right, where resources are allocated efficiently, where really good companies, unlike Theranos and other really good companies, get capital at a reasonable cost of capital, then you have to keep the market efficient. If you want to make it efficient, you have to have the right incentives in the money management industry, right? So people say hedge funds are bad, but I would argue hedge funds are good, because somebody has to have the capital to get this done. Otherwise, the mistakes will continue to persist. So before we dump on hedge funds, we should consider that these funds actually play an important role in making sure that prices are kept in line. And the picture I showed you that anomalies profits decrease over time is obviously suggestive that these funds actually do the job. So another thing that you might take away from this is that when people are really emotional, positively inclined to invest in the stock market as measured by sentiment, prices are more likely to be out of line. That's a good, important thing to note, that in these cases, the prices in these markets should be viewed with caution. Right? That's another important implication. And finally, I would argue, so let's talk about what remains to be done in this arena. I think there are a lot more things to be done. Financial mediation and liquidity are important issues. We need to understand in more detail the role of retail investors in causing anomalies. The barrier to understanding the second bullet point, like you say, mutual funds cause anomalies, but then also an important source of these anomalies are retail investors. The barrier is that in the United States and even in Canada, we cannot identify retail investors. But if you could identify which trades are emanating from retail investors, then you could actually see if retail investors are overpricing companies in high sentiment periods. That's something that could be ascertained if people do get proprietary access to those data. And I believe in some countries like China and stuff, those data are available. So that's something to keep in mind. And so that's another important point. The other thing is, of course, that you should keep markets liquid and don't interfere with them, don't break them. And some people could argue, well, now you're going back to efficient markets. No. What I'm saying is that the mechanism by which markets become efficient is by keeping incentives in the money management industry properly aligned and by keeping the markets liquid. So if you don't interfere with the markets, you get more liquidity. If you get more liquidity, you get more arbitrage and you get more efficient prices, which is all we all want. A last point is something that's more interesting from a theoretical standpoint, which is that let's suppose that we take the J paper's result at face value. Let's take one more minute. Face value and say everything's stopped working. Right? Suppose we take that at face value, right? So if we take that at face value, then what do hedge funds do? Oh, this paper in J says that nothing's working. Let's shift that in some other direction. So go to convertible bond arbitrage or something. Well, if everyone shifts away, then they start working again because the mistakes come back, right? So from a theoretical standpoint, it seems that there might be some cyclicality in anomalies. So if people overexploit them, then they stop working, and at that point, people shift away from them. And then it means they come back. So whether that actually will happen remains to be seen. But that's an interesting thing, cycles and anomalies based on the degree of their exploitation by institutions and so on and so forth. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
There are 3 questions.
Let partner do it because some of the things are going to overlap, then we can have a joint and more efficient partner. Thank you.
Hopefully I can get this thing working sooner.
Sorry.
So I'd like to thank Samir and the conference organizers for inviting me to present at this conference. And a couple of things. When Samir asked me to do this, I asked him, what should I do now? He said, no, what do we want? Something on valuation. So I also looked at who the other panelists were, right? So I'm just going to throw in a Seinfeld reference. I like to throw Seinfeld references in. This happens when George Costanza is appointed to work for the New York Yankees, right? And Jerry Seinfeld looks at him and says, DiMaggio, Mantle, and Costanza? So I have the same feeling right now with S.P. Kothari, Subrahmanyam, and Mohanram. I mean, really, so I'm very honored to be in a panel with these very eminent people, and I don't know if I belong, but I try to do what I can. Also, many of the things I say are going to sound a lot like what Abhinidhar just said, right? So it's just from more of an accounting perspective. I guess that's the downside of going last, but that's okay. All right, so a little bit about myself. So, I'm the CPM Direct Professor here. I'm also the director of this thing called the India Innovation Institute. So I'm going to take a 30-second to plug this institute, right? So we're trying to hold some very interesting sort of policy and panel-based discussions with the focus on India and innovation. So this past weekend, we had an interview with I had an interview with like 400 people in the audience with Arun Jaitley, the Finance Minister of India, and so we have other interesting talks. So for those of you in the area, please keep a lookout and come for our events. Okay. So my research interests are in valuation, fundamental analysis, earnings management, compensation, and just a brief outline of the talk. I'll try to focus on valuation and where I see opportunities for future research. So mine is going to be much more about the small topics, not focused on a couple of big picture topics like the previous two panelists. And I try to be forward-looking. I guess I'm probably not old enough, but I'm not going to be, man, in the good old days, we used to do really important and interesting work, and now everybody's doing a bunch of crap. No, you're not going to hear that from me. So, okay. So many of these ideas I identify will be interdisciplinary because that's the kind of work I like to do. And there'll be no, where is the accounting? That's a question, I mean, I hear that in seminars all the time, and that's a question I particularly dislike. To me, it's everywhere, so you don't need to ask the question. And we want excessive citations of my own papers to follow, okay? So this is just the sort of disclaimers out of the way. So here are some things I think which would be interesting for us as accounting researchers in the area of valuation to look at. So we've had this strong emphasis or focus on just looking at valuation of equity. I think there's far more to look at, and I think accounting will play, and financial statement information probably will play important roles in things beyond equity. So for example, now people start looking at debt markets. Talking about anomalies, Swaminathan and Bojaj and Swaminathan had a paper about whether there's the equivalent anomaly holds in debt markets. Similarly, there's a paper by Richardson and some of his co-authors from London Business School talking about value investing in credit markets. So one of our students here at Toronto, Matt Lyle, who is at Kellogg, looked at, does information quality, people have talked about, is information quality priced in equity markets, and the question has always been, well, is it idiosyncratic or is it systematic and so on and so forth. But Matt looked at it in the context of the option market where it's volatility, you don't really care whether it's systematic or idiosyncratic. So I think looking beyond equity can help us address some very interesting questions. Which may be related to things like the sophistication of the market participants, diversification of investors, and also, what is, like I said, what is idiosyncratic and what is systematic, and does that even matter? So these are all interesting sort of questions which can be addressed when one sort of looks beyond equity. So I think it's an interesting area to look at. Okay. The second thing is, and this is something where SP has also done some work, and it's increasingly becoming common in accounting, is looking at the aggregate. So there's a recent interest, I would say in the last 10 or 15 years, on the role of accounting numbers in the aggregate. So, and one of the interesting things is there's remarkable differences between what you see sort of in traditional firm level, cross-sectional sort of research, and what you see in aggregate time series. So, for example, Sloan's well-established accrual anomaly paper, which there's been a whole cottage industry of research as to whether it's risk or mispricing and so on and so forth. But Hirschleifer et al. Showed a paper where the effect actually was opposite in terms of whether the cash flow component or the accrual component of earnings, how they predict future returns. Similarly, you had Bernard and Thomas and SP's own paper in GFE about the role of earning surprises, and so a look at the drift in a very, very simplified way, but at the aggregate level, right? So just because the results are different doesn't necessarily mean that one refutes the other. It's just that it's probably showing you a different side of how these numbers are used. So for example, the Hirschleifer et al. Paper, in fact, Hirschleifer have another paper where they claim to show that the accrual anomaly is mispricing and not risk. So, but what they say in their paper is that positive aggregate accruals is probably a sign of something to do with investment opportunities or future discount rates and so on and so forth. So I think the takeaway is accounting numbers can be extremely insightful even if they mean different things. Now, one interesting question to ask is, if everybody starts focusing on the aggregate, what happens to the underlying? So I was at the last conference recently where Charles Lee and his co-authors presented a very interesting paper entitled The Dark Side of ETFs, where one of the interesting points was if there's an increasing amount, like let's say your firm is more likely to be in an ETF, you actually find increases in things like return synchronicity, reduction in analyst following, and so on and so forth, because people don't care about your firm as a firm, they care about you just being part of a larger index. So that's, I think, is a very interesting counterpoint to this whole thing of looking at the aggregate. There's also been a lot of research on accounting and, broadly speaking, the macroeconomy. So for example, growing research on the importance of accounting information for macroeconomic forecasting and vice versa. So you'll see a common thread across all these papers. That is, they all are Konchichi and Patatukas, because I'm just familiar with the research that these guys are doing. I'm sure there are a lot of other excellent researchers who will be focusing on this, but these guys have done some really interesting work on using accounting information to forecast GDP, using financial statement analysis for macro forecasting. The recent paper, also in the same last conference, was how you can use firm-level earnings released to nowcast GDP, not forecast. So you're forecasting current quarter. Typically, there's a lag in terms of when GDPs are forecasted, but you can use earnings information to nowcast GDP, right? So I think this is a very, very interesting area of research. Now, when we do forecasting in our different settings, and I've written papers on forecasting in the context of implied cost of capital, we tend to focus on firm-level variables. So I think there's an opportunity to sort of incorporate macro-level variables, because certainly those will have implications for how good your forecasts are and how good whatever you're doing with the forecasts are. So for example, your measures or estimates of implied cost of capital. Now this is the part where it's going to overlap a lot with what Subra talked about, risk and mispricing, right? So one of the fundamental challenges in any research on fundamental analysis, and I've written a number of papers in this area, is fundamental analysis, fundamentally questions market efficiency. So naturally, you should have a high standard of proof before you call something an anomaly or mispricing, which is fair. So you've got to show the consistency of returns across time. You've got to talk about the timing of the bad returns, and you have to have rigorous asset pricing test. And this is something which I know Subra is going to agree with me completely. I don't know about SP, but anyway. It seems to be that it has to be a risk. Guys get a free pass. Like, it's like, I was just telling Subra this over the break, and this is going to be a little bit of history and a little bit of religion here, right? One of the interesting mysteries in world history is India is the home of Buddhism, but there's hardly any Buddhists left in India. Now here's the reason for that, right? Hinduism incorporated Buddhism as one of the 10 avatars of Vishnu. So that's, to me, is the farmer French factor model. So you have up to 10 factors potentially available, and whenever a new effect is shown, farmer French will say, no, don't worry, we have slot number 5 is open for you. We'll call it RMW or we'll call it CMA and so on and so forth. I'm ridiculously oversimplifying this, but I'm trying to, and over-exaggerating like crazy, but I'm trying to make a point here, right? So you need to have a more flexible, and in my opinion, less dogmatic view, right? It's not so much about efficiency versus inefficiency as it is about adaptive efficiency, right? So fundamental analysis is actually proves that markets are actually sort of efficient. That is, once you tell them that this is how you're being inefficient, like as Subra said, arbitrages rush in, other people go in, and they make the markets more efficient. So for the accrual anomaly, there's this paper titled Going, Gone, written by John Hand and others, which show that as hedge funds moved in, accruals are less likely to be mispriced. I also had a sort of similar parallel paper which had a different argument, which shows that as analysts issue cash flow forecasts, in a sense, providing accrual forecasts in conjunction with the earnings forecast, and as the information or forecasted information about accruals improved, markets were less likely to misprice accruals. So to me, this is consistent with this notion of adaptive efficiency. And so in some sense, the success of fundamental analysis is actually a reflection of the eventual, and I would argue, inherent efficiency of the capital markets. Now, again, asset pricing in an accounting perspective. So the latest Farmer French model has 5 factors. And we can argue about whether book to market is risk or mispricing, and obviously you have different opinions on that. But let's just focus on the two most recent factors, CMA and RMW. And Subra's already talked about the asset growth as well as the profitability. So related to this, right? So these are empirical factors that may meet the necessary condition for being risk factor, right? They're positive and they generally seem to have significant, economically significant and consistent risk premium. But is that sufficient? Will they hold up to greater scrutiny? So for those of you who've done asset pricing, Daniel and Titman did this with the book market factors, which kind of question whether these things are actually risk or mispricing. So on the other hand, can you come up with an economic rationale for some of these risk stories and something more than just sort of hand waving? So Penman at Columbia has, which is kind of interesting because Penman wrote some of the most influential papers on fundamental analysis, but Penman has a series of papers right now which he argues that earnings growth is actually risk. And he talks about the fact that the growth very often is a reflection of where the accounting deals with earnings. So for example, when we force firms to expense R&D, that's a notion of risk. And that shows up in higher growth because you have less earnings now and more earnings tomorrow. So, I mean, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with those papers, but at least there's an attempt to provide an economic rationale for some of these stories. And this is also tied to much earlier work by Basu, and this is not Sudipta Basu, but an earlier Basu, in the Journal of Finance and by Ray Ball. Oh, okay.
Sanjay.
Yeah. So there are other work which have also tried to provide a risk-based story for this notion of why earning. And if you go back to the original Farmer French paper, the 1992 or 93 papers, right? It was purely a horse race, and EPP barely lost out to B2M. In that original horse race. Otherwise, you would have like earnings in that model. You can argue it's wrong, but it would have been there right in the beginning. It just shows you how it's related to a point I'm going to make in one of my later slides. Oh, sorry, my next bullet point, right? Very next bullet point, right? In accounting, right, we've got this notion that whatever the finance guys do, and no disrespect to the finance guys, they're awesome, okay? But the stuff they do is not manna from heaven, which we have to receive and just take as given. Like I went and I got these, to me, there's this, if you've seen the movie The History of the World, there's a famous scene where Moses goes on top and he's carrying 3 tablets and he comes back and God gave me this, and he drops 1 and then 15 becomes 10 commandments. Because he just dropped 1, he doesn't have those other 5. So we've got to take these things with a pinch of salt, right? So to give you an example, this notion that PIN is information risk. The whole influential papers by Easley O'Hara, O'Hara and others, there's been some research so Lambert Lois America had an empirical theoretical paper, and I had a paper with Shiva Rajgopal in the JE in 2009, where we actually test this thing and we actually disprove this notion that PIN is actually a priced risk factor. Now I'll talk a little bit about measurement of cost of capital because that's an area I do research in, or have done some research in. So many people have also questioned these models based on these well-cited critiques by Easton and Monahan and others that, these models are really messy, they don't really tie up with future returns, the underlying noise were noisy, the analyst forecasts are biased. Now, if you actually follow the literature and see the most recent papers, I would argue that these are not concerns. So the recent research indicates, and if you notice that I'm citing a bunch of my own papers here, so I apologize for that. So recent research indicates that many of these factors can actually be easily mitigated. Like analyst forecasts, you can easily adjust for predictable bias in analyst forecasts. Using just their past information, you can econometrically take out the already sort of pre-existing bias, and when you clean up the numbers, these implied cost of capital models actually behave extremely well. And if you go to cross-sectional forecasting model, and there's a paper by Ho et al., which we improve upon using accounting information as opposed to sort of more of a cash flow information, we show that these cross-sectional forecasting models provide us with perfectly acceptable measures of earnings forecasts, which then lead to what I would call well-behaved measures of implied cost of capital, things that both line up with what we call risk factors and also correlate well with future returns. This has actually been used in the finance literature. So there's a paper in JFE in 2013, which shows that this aggregate implied cost of capital actually is a very good measure of predicting sort of future market returns. Now, one issue in this whole implied cost of capital literature is, and this is related to our discussion of risk and mispricing, we still don't know when these models work well. Is it because of risk or is it because of mispricing? Because the two are observationally equivalent. So consider a firm which has a high implied cost of capital, and if you believe the risk story, high implied cost of capital means high risk and therefore you get high returns. But if you believe a mispricing story, high implied cost of capital means that you are basically misvalued, you are undervalued, market realizes you're undervalued, this market corrects and you get high returns. And the two are essentially observationally equivalent. So I think it will be interesting if people can work on trying to separate out these two stories. You might actually get a better measure. If you can sort of remove the mispricing component, you might get a better measure of the sort of true risk or the true cost of capital for a firm using the ICC approach. Okay? So I'm now going to talk a little bit about focusing on ignored areas. I'll give you one example. So banking. The way we deal with problem areas in research is we just avoid them. So the first thing you'll see in any paper is, oh, I deleted all firms in SIC 48, banks and financial institutions and utilities or whatever it is. We just delete them, right? And so it's like saying, you know, we talk about risk and mispricing and are stocks valued rationally or are they mispriced? But we've never actually analyzed bank stocks because we just delete them usually, right? So I've actually made a career of trying to work in these niche areas which everybody else is ignoring, which may or may not be a good thing. They may be ignoring it because there's nothing to see there. So, give an example. Right? Fundamental analysis, people say, you know, it does not work or it cannot work in growth stocks. Similarly, it does not work or cannot be made to work in things like banks and financial institutions because the accounting is different, the disclosure norms are different, all your traditional ratios, none of them will work. So, I would argue that problem areas are actually opportunities for research and which have real and practical implications. So I wrote a paper in 2005 which actually had a lot of difficulty publishing. But I met Professor Subrahmanyam for the first time today and he says, you're the G-score guy. And I was like, you know, a very well-known eminent professor in finance calling me the G-score guy. I said, hey, that's pretty cool. You know, so anyway, that paper essentially shows that fundamental analysis can be very successful when you understand the accounting issues and you sort of tailor it to the context of growth stocks. So I have a recent working paper with two of my colleagues, Dushyant Vyas and Sasan, who's our PhD student who's at Waterloo, where we actually tailor fundamental analysis for bank stocks, where we said, okay, you know what? I know banks are different, but fundamentally a firm's stock valuation should depend on its ability to generate excess profits, the growth in these profits and risk. So let's look at banks and let's try to come up with ratios looking at banks' financial statements to pick up elements of these three things. And so we do that and we've come up with this incredibly innovative name called B-score. And we show that the B-score actually is incredibly successful. And most interestingly, it works very well during the financial crisis. So during the financial crisis, right, the whole banking sector earned negative 60%, but if you're invested in these high B-score firms, you would earn negative returns, but it would be negative 10%. So forget the hedge returns, it should provide you insurance, nothing else, right? So and one of the things we're working on in the revision right now is trying to figure out, you know, why we think this thing works. And one of the things we've come up with is, and this is based on both what practitioners say as well as what our results seem to indicate, is when people focus on banks, it's excessive anchoring on one ratio. People focus a lot on ROE. So because people focus on ROE, banks also work towards that and they take decisions like the excessive leverage and stuff which are focused on ROE as well. And they sort of miss out the finer details and the finer drivers of valuation, which is what our research seems to indicate. Okay. Another thing, this is something I just thought of a couple of days ago, and I know nothing about tax, except for that I pay a little more of it since moving to Canada. But so tax and valuation is another, in my opinion, is largely an unexplored area. So we had Michelle Hanlon from MIT actually present just 2 days ago in our conference, and she was presenting a paper that shows that even sophisticated users people who are tax debtors in corporations are not correct about using, effective tax rate, marginal tax rates, and all these kind of things for decisions like investments. And they actually tie that into inefficiencies in capital structure and, investment decisions and so on. So if that is the case, how about investors? Do investors consider the tax efficiency of the companies they're investing in? This is especially the case that the only money most of us get to see is the after-tax dollar. I mean, some exceptions do exist, like Donald Trump, for instance, but most of us get to see only after-tax dollars, right? So I think as accountants, we can add to this sort of very important macroeconomic debate on tax policy as well. By the way, there's some very interesting papers here. Folks at Columbia, Khan, Nalreddy, and Bruin, they actually argue that the US has high, corporate tax rates, and that leads to a divergence between corporate profits and GDP growth simply because the money is not being reinvested in the US, and they tie it into that. And similarly, Edwards et al., and Alex is one of our faculty here, they argue that this sort of trapped foreign cash leads to firms essentially making bad M&A decisions using the foreign cash because they have something to do with it. They just make bad acquisitions at a cross-border level. So the other thing I want to talk about briefly is research in emerging markets. Again, this is something which I haven't done any research on myself, but I think we really need to encourage research that uses data outside of the US. So often papers are rejected because questions are asked like, what are the broader implications of this beyond the setting you're looking at? Well, obviously, in some cases, if somebody says, okay, I want to study the value elements of information in Ghana, or something very specific, that's a fair concern, right? But if someone is looking at an important and significant economy, which is essentially is going to play an increasingly important role in the world, why does it have to be relevant to the US? If someone's looking at stuff in China or India, that should be important for everyone, because in some sense, whether we like it or not, the future of the world resides in that sector of the globe. Okay? So I think within valuation and fundamental analysis, right, looking at emerging markets may give us another look at risk versus mispricing. And you can also have some controlled experiments because you have different regulatory changes which took place in different points of time, and you can explore some really interesting things like changing disclosure quality, accounting standards, institutions, governance, enforcement. How do all of these things affect market efficiency? Interdisciplinary work. I think we need to encourage and reward interdisciplinary work both within accounting and across accounting and other disciplines. So here are some of my sort of big picture recommendations. I don't know if these will ever happen. I think we need to broaden the definition of what we consider top tier journalists. And the most important thing we need to do is we need to read papers and stop counting. Stop counting how many top 3s or how many top 5s and so on and so this person has. I think that's very, very important. And I think journals also need to be a little more open towards ideas, big picture ideas, different methodologies and different approaches. And we need to somehow figure out a way to encourage, junior people shouldn't just be hitting singles all the time or trying to hit singles, not even being ambitious. I mean, you need to have a portfolio, but you should also work on interesting big picture ideas. And lastly, this is a pet peeve of mine. We need to stop being dogmatic and ask questions like, why is this accounting? And every time I go to a conference, seminar, and it happens a lot to my own papers, that's probably why I don't like this question. But we shouldn't be asking these kinds of questions. For me, accounting is information. It's information economics. Maybe if we label ourselves information economics, we might be better off as a profession. Okay. The last thing, and again, this is me complaining and bitching about stuff, so I hope you forgive me for that. I think we need to, as researchers, we need to search for the truth and not protect whatever turf we've decided is our turf. Okay. So I've noticed this in many conferences, and I've seen this in the ICC literature. There's some people who write a paper, and other people will write a paper refuting that paper, and these people write, there'll be an A and a B and a C and a D, and everybody is like, I've seen this in a couple of areas, right? ABC writes a report to XYZ who then replies, and then that person replies, and so on and so forth. And this is especially the case in this risk versus risk pricing thing, in the area that I work on quite closely, right? Or research on whether a certain model is correct or not. And this happens a lot in accounting, So we should, in my sort of idealistic view, right, we should be truth seekers. If good research would imply belief revision, in my opinion, including your own beliefs, It shouldn't be you changing other people's beliefs. It also should be you willing to change your own beliefs because of what other people show in response to your claims, right? If I'm wrong, I would like to know. At least that's my opinion. Okay.
Also, it's not that easy. Suppose you write a paper and somebody slams it. We'll see then.
I did not say that. This was like purely my own sort of ivory tower thing. I was not trying to be actually practical on that slide. This, on the other hand, for any junior empiricists in the room, is actual practical advice. Okay, double check your work. It's really important. Okay, here's the deal: if you do stuff which is especially of methodological nature, it will be replicated, and it better replicate. That's the first thing. Second thing, make sure that you understand all tests in the paper. I've noticed this when somebody presents a paper and asks a question, they'll say, well, my co-author did that part. Even if a co-author does that part, you should be, it's like collectively and collective joint responsibility for everything which has your name on it. I think it's really, really important, right? And the last thing is share your code freely. I've done this a lot, so whenever anybody wants any sort of ICC stuff, whether it's the stuff on calculating implied cost of capital or adjusting forecast, I very freely share my code. I've done the first couple of slides, so I'm not worried about mistakes in my code, so I'm okay, right? The IIT computer science degree came to use finally. So, and the last thing, and this is just, again, I think whenever possible, you should use the simplest research design. I personally, something goes off when I hear words like, I'm using a hidden Markov Latin variable analysis with right-censored quotient exact matching. By the way, I completely made that up. I just threw some phrases in. But you do see stuff like this. And whenever that goes up, my sort of BS meter starts flashing very, very high. Okay, I think that's one thing I would like to say. Okay, so just a summary. I've tried to highlight what I find interesting and exciting in the area of valuation. I've also tried to express how I would like our profession to evolve, where we allow for differences of opinion and worldviews to flourish, encourage big picture work that can actually make an impact in the real world, and also encourage interdisciplinary work. Okay? And the last point is, be careful how you apply my advice, it might get you fired. In my case, twice. But it might also end you might also end up in a beautiful city like Toronto and a lovely country like Canada, so it's not all bad. All right? Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll open up the floor for questions. I think we had Professor Subrahmanyam present before, and then Partha. If there are any questions for Partha, can you hold them off and ask those questions of Subra first, because he has a flight to catch. So probably front load the questions to Subra. Yes. If they have.
Or not?
Does anyone?
I don't understand. Are you taking up questions or not?
Yes,
we have 10 minutes, yeah.
We have questions, but the questions for Subra first, because he has a flight to catch. And
I have questions.
Back load to Partha.
I have a different question. Hedge funds benefit by taking advantage of market friction or frictions in the market. Why would hedge funds not take advantage of all anomalies and they leave money on the table?
Are you trying to say why the anomalies don't disappear right away?
Yes, well, I'm saying it differently because we have a mechanism called hedge funds that did not exist before.
Right.
That exploit this feature.
Okay, so here's the question. Let's suppose that we see an anomaly on the table documented by Ball or Brown or Sloan or whatever. The question is, how much capital does it take to make that anomaly go away? Do we have an answer to that? I mean, that's a question that requires an answer. Without an answer to the question, how much capital does it take to make the anomaly go away, the notion as to why hedge funds don't exploit it instantly is somewhat problematical. So my view would be that in a world where people are human, it takes time to discover anomalies, implement a trading strategy, and trade on them. And also to ensure adequate capital, it's going to be extremely difficult to say that the anomaly comes, Sloan publishes in 96, and in 97 it's gone. We just don't know how much capital it takes. So my view would be that there are issues like shorting restrictions. You want to short high accrual stocks, you can't just go and short a small company stock to infinite degrees, right? There's going to be margin calls, there's going to be brokerage issues, there's going to be horizon issues, like you can't just hold a short position for a year. So these are all issues that you have to address, right? So my view would be that there are frictions in the hedge fund industry as well. They can't just take infinite positions. And if they cannot, then it will take time. right? So as the industry grows, right, becomes bigger, the normally profits will drop, and which is what we see. That's the best answer I have.
Well, I don't know. I will not pursue the question further, but I think the hedge funds have enough money to wipe out any amount.
Okay. So,
Well, can I?
yeah, please. He's the boss.
He's also an expert.
I'm not.
No, but this is, see, hedge funds, if we go with the hypothesis that they don't have enough capital to wipe out the thing, fair enough. But that would imply that they should be earning higher rates of return then. Because our numbers haven't been wiped out, and they have limited capital that still leaves money on the table. But the trouble is, hedge funds haven't been able to demonstrate that they earn anything positive beyond expenses. In fact,
So I would bring that same hypothesis back to you. I mean, they're competing, no? So they're overdoing, right?
No. See, you can't play it both ways. You can't say
But
that
you
they
can't-
don't have enough capital, and now you are saying they have so much competition that they are losing money because of that.
No, that's not what I'm
So
saying.
that's, well,
I agree.
so that's the sense in which I think there is, to me, market may or may not be efficient, but they do seem unpredictable. And that's why people are not able to, I mean, it's possible that markets are inefficient. I don't know, and that's why I keep publishing these papers as an editor. I accept them, but what I do know is when people have tried to earn money off of that, I haven't seen many people able to make money. So that's the sense in which I think that's humbling, at least to me, because I tried also.
Well, so the question is whether some of the anomalies are real or they are artifacts from the data we use. Right?
Yeah, well, that is in my view, I mean, I don't know about ST, but that's in my view not a doubt. That could be done only if you really are that not believe in market efficiency. It's possible, it's hard to make money on that for various reasons, but it is not possible to say that's the artifact of the data we use. I'm trying to explain to you. Let's take momentum. You do momentum first half of the sample, right? 63 to 93, you get momentum. You get momentum 93 to 14, you get momentum. You get momentum in China, you get momentum in UK, you get momentum in Germany, you get momentum in every country around the world. If you're going to say there's a global systematic data that drives momentum, it's possible, that I can't rule out. But the fact that it's so robust, not just momentum, but any anomaly you pick has the same issue. Right?
Well, I can tell you, people in the finance departments at the university, try to replicate Sloan study, and they couldn't.
So you're saying accruals can't be replicated? Well, that could explain why Barclays...
No, I think that's an unfair statement. I think this must be somebody...
You should wonder about your college.
No, it doesn't.
I have personally replicated accruals, that's not...
Yeah, a finance person may not know the difference between cash flow and accruals. That could be the problem.
I have replicated accruals myself, So I don't know which department that might be. But it could be that if your advisor is an efficient market theorist who believes that market should be efficient at every instant, then that could be a bias in the way the study is conducted. Look, I don't want to get into all these things, right? But I feel that these types of biases could influence subconsciously what kind of conclusion you arrive at. So that's a big concern.
I'll say one thing and I'll stop.
Yeah.
If we believe what we're saying, we'll be big investors in the market.
Sure.
Right? Why not?
Well, there's a difference between economic and statistical significance on paper and actually trying to make money from it. But the fact that you can't make money from it, but the fact that you can't make money from it does not detract from the scientific finding that there are paper profits which are statistically and economically significant. You can't make money from it is not a reason to say they don't exist, is what I'm trying to explain to you. That's all. All right? Now, since I'm not into that stuff, I can't say anything more than that, the fact that the paper profits do exist.
I can have another day with you.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? Yes, Madhu, you're being patient, yes. Yeah,
Is it for me?
We know that end-to-end, since the multi-level right? Equity is earlier now, and end-to-end, who basically uncover the idiosyncratic volatility factor for this pricing anomaly, right?
I can't hear you very well. Please. Yeah, go ahead.
So Ken just quit his job at Columbia.
And,
Yeah, to
What do you mean by factors? I don't understand.
Anomalies.
Well, I just gave you my view on anomalies. I spoke for 30 minutes. What else do you I'm a bit confused on what you want. You want me to talk about Andrew Ang or?
Well, you can talk about him, and that's an interesting example.
Well, I think that in my view that the industry is not necessarily looking for people who actually trade on anomalies. The industry is looking for people with IQ, talent, and the knack for understanding what equity markets are about. So I'm not sure Andrew Ang is being hired because he discovered the eyeball factor. I don't think that's the reason. I think he is being hired because he's a smart guy who's interested and he's high IQ and think he can help them understand how to construct a sensible strategy. So I don't want to go into why Andrew Ang was hired at BlackRock and factors and stuff like that. I do believe, however, in general, that there are significant paper profits to be made and significant economically and statistically, and all I'm saying is that it's extremely hard to rationalize the pattern of the paper profits we see, reconcile that with the notion of market. That's all. And so I have nothing to say specifically beyond what I said on why Andrew Ang is going to BlackRock.
I just had a quick question about the last point you said about how improving liquidity would alleviate some of the anomalies.
Yes.
And sort of take that to the bond markets though.
Yeah.
It has some unintended consequences of dealers whose spreads got compressed and they decided to sort of walk away from that in terms of liquidity going down. Recently people were arrested and so on. So what I'm saying is sometimes what transparency and liquidity may have unintended consequences, especially in the context of OTC markets.
Right.
So any thoughts?
Right. So very quickly, the basic idea there is that there's a question of liquidity, how much liquidity. So let me give you a point. Let's take a muni bond market or corporate bond market. If it's so illiquid that there are 3 transactions per day, a competitive market won't do the job because a competitive market, the rents will be competed to zero, and people who want to buy at 4 p.m., for example, at close of market might not even get the quotes they need because the dealers don't want to deal with. If you instead have a monopolistic dealer in that case, they'll be cross subsidies, right? So they'll be willing to provide liquidity continuously because they essentially get some rents from doing so. So I think that competition can be counterproductive, but the cases are limited. They're going to be extremely illiquid markets where that will be the case. In most equity market situations, however, I believe that that's not an issue. They're so actively traded that competition would be the way to go.
Chris?
How do you think about the future of the anomaly research?
The direction of the anomaly research.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on whether, look, my view on this is that I agree with Partha that the problem really is that the incentives for junior faculty are a bit of a problem, right? So do we really want to take on pharma and French? I mean, like how many people really want to in this room, right? Like you don't want to get papers published, it's best to just develop another fact or test a factor model and you go with the flow. However, I would argue that the real rents in the anomaly literature lie in not discovering more anomalies, but trying to understand from a deeper standpoint what the microstructure of the anomalies and what's going on and who's causing them, right? So at this point, it's very well to say that people misprice accruals, right? But who? Do we know? Like who in the market, which agents misprice accruals? How do people actually form beliefs, right? How do people look at a financial statement and form a belief about the future earnings of a company or the future cash flows from a company? We have a lot of these models like Olson and stuff like that, but we don't have an understanding of what goes into people's heads when they form beliefs. So anything we can do using light from foreign markets, shedding light from foreign markets like data and like how do retail investors react to high accrual companies or high momentum companies or things like that. Those types of issues I think are very interesting and important because we really do need to understand the black box of accruals or earning surprises or things like that, how it actually happens, who's causing the problem, who's fixing the problem. So I think that angle on the agents, the formation of agents' beliefs that create the statistical and economic profits would be a useful direction.
I have a last question. Maybe.
Oh man,
we
have a whole day.
Chris has been waiting patiently. Go ahead.
I'm really surprised that Olson model still has followers. That is a model that predicts valuation without any factor for market risk.
Sure.
Nothing. So why is it having following even among finance people? I don't understand it.
No. It doesn't have a following. It's just that I happen to be on the interface of accounting and finance with a keen interest in accounting literature, but most finance people wouldn't not even have heard of Olson. So I'm sorry, it's just me, not finance.
I heard you say it twice or so.
I know. That doesn't mean I'm representative of the finance profession. One final thing on the Olson model. I think that it would be my belief that it may be, my view is that risk simply isn't priced in the cross-section of equities. It's priced in aggregate. The market portfolio has a positive risk premium, but in the cross-section, pricing risk is complicated. I think the valuation models are a better way to go than trying to price risk. It's very difficult to get evidence that risk is priced. Try to test the CAPM, you'll find that data is insignificant no matter what country, what time period you use. You can check that out. That's mine.
One last question, because there's a time constraint, yes.
No, I'm curious if the panel members have ever read David Hume, who of course provides epistemological basis for the evidence claims that you're making, or even if you've read Karl Popper, or the philosophy of science, that the work of Gareth Ward.
Okay, well.
The claims that are made widely in finance and accounting are in any other discipline, would be considered probably indefensible for the most part. So the nature of evidence is very different. You may recall the last slide that I put up said, how do I deny what I just said? What is wrong with what I just said? What evidence is there that in fact contradicts me? Because the requirement of through scientific research is to search for why it is that you are wrong. And you know in philosophy that a single case invalidates a premise. But we in fact look at things, I mean, nobody's talking about Richard Roll. Richard Roll basically said most of the tests we do, we simply cannot do. Everybody ignores that because they don't want to have to deal with the Roll critiques. There were people trying to back in the 70s and the 80s, but nobody was successful because they can't. Mathematically, he demonstrated you can't do that testing. And yes, I understand the values of being practiced and published, but if you're going to search for truth, you really need to think about the epistemological basis of what you're doing in the first place.
Okay, first of all, I would like to point out that it's not clear I should be very defensive about what you just asked me, but let me be very clear. I did not cite my work except for 1 or 2 papers. It has nothing to do with me per se. There were at least 12 papers discussed, only 2 are mine, and they were actually the minor contributions. I have nothing at stake here. I have no turf war to deal with. I've written papers on both sides. I'm trying to explain to you the following phenomenon that exists in finance and accounting. The phenomenon is that MBA students are taught risk-based models as if they were God's gospel, that this is the truth. And I'm trying to explain to you that as a scientist, you got to first search for the truth that either accepts those models or doesn't accept those models. And I'm trying to present you some evidence that that gospel, there's no evidence supporting it as a scientist, that as far as I can see. The epistemological basis for this is something we can discuss at length. But I have a straw man, and that straw man is risk-based approaches we teach our students. There is no empirical support for them that I consider reliable. That's all I was trying to say. It is not that I'm trying to push an agenda on you, and I'm not trying to push an agenda on anyone here. If you disbelieve me, that's totally your call, your decision, and that's your prerogative. Any other questions?
And that's your last word, and you have a flight to catch over this.
Thank you so much.
As we bring this symposium to a close, we'd like to ask Khalid Nainar, who is the incoming president of CIIAA, to say a few words.
Thank you. But before that, let me finish off this little task that was given to me. Thanks, SP. This is just a token of organization.
Thank you.
And partner for you. Okay, just an extra one. I'm sorry, I forgot. This you can see. Okay, I've been asked to say a few words. I think the first thing is actually to acknowledge the hard work the organizing committee has probably put in to put together all these sessions, to get these people all over here from all different parts of the world. Some of them have been traveling, like SP is saying he just recently came from Malaysia, he's on his way to some other place. So all this logistics takes a lot of work, and I think we should all give the organizing committee a big hand at this time. And they said all not remain nameless because as we went through the program, many a time, everybody was constantly acknowledging Samar. Samar, you're an important person, but there are other important people as well on the committees. So let me acknowledge them. One is Mohammed Ayadi from Brock. Okay, Joanne Jones from York. Adrian Solis, okay, from York. I think maybe you should all stand up so people can see who these people are. Otherwise, sometimes people remain nameless.
Stand up. Yes. So they know.
Adrian Solis from York, Nabil Tahani from York, and Samar, of course, is right here. Thank you. Okay, as far as, again, putting on my hat as the incoming president of the CAAA, or for those of you who may not know, Canadian Academic Accounting Association, there were two other past presidents who were in the hall. Alan Richardson, he was here yesterday, as well as Meridi. I think she left because she had a flight to catch as well. So one of the things that the association is working towards is to kind of harness all these academic energies that are actually happening within the political geography jurisdiction of Canada, but is actually being lost because it's not being archived and so on. So one of the things that we are actually have a plan going forward is anytime all these symposiums are being organized, there will be a kind of an archive. I know some of these papers show up on SSRM and so on, but to actually have a record that symposiums are actually happening, and also the CAAA can get more actively involved to help in the logistics of putting together some of these symposiums going forward. And so with those, I don't think I have any other extra any comments to make because this was all at very short notice. I was asked to do some of these things. So, but I thought I should share that the executive committee of the CAAA is really working on is to make sure that whatever is happening within Canada is really gets organized, and basically the association should not just be some, something in the ether and not many people hear about it except for the CAR conference and the CAAA meetings, but in our day-to-day life as academics, I think we should increasingly see the presence of CAAA. So that's all I have something to say, and at this point in time, I think wherever you came from, travel safely. Maybe Samar actually has the last word, so you want to say something, please take it.
Thank you very much, Khalid. Everything good has come to an end, and I'm so happy that I'm done because I flew all the way from Hong Kong for this symposium. I really want to thank from the bottom of my heart our panelists, Professor Rashid Abdul Khaliq, Professor Kothari, Professor Partha Mohanram, Professor Abhinadar Subrahmanyam, Professor Alan Richardson, and Fred Price. I know that these people are so busy, and I know that sometimes I twist their arms, like Professor Kothari, who was in Malaysia, and I met him at the JAV conference in Lake Louise. I said, I'm doing this, and I really want you to be our keynote speaker, and without hesitation he said, I'll be very glad to do it, and please, all the audience, join me in thanking our panelists. The success of this event also is partly due to our presenters. It's, in Ontario we don't have such venue where accounting and finance across the province get together and meet and present paper in a very collegial and constructive environment. And we hope, like with our colleague at York, we offer this kind of venue to do this presentation. So please join me in thanking all our presenters at this symposium. Finally, I really want to thank the CPA Ontario. And again, I have to reiterate, it's not really about the money, but about this CAAA willingness to connect with excellence in academic research and accounting and finance education. So, and I want to thank the Dean of the School of Administrative Study for their for the sponsorship of this, for this first unique initiative in Ontario, in fact. So without any further ado, I'll give it to Adriano to say the final words. Thank you very much.
When Samir came to York in the spring to give us a talk he invited us to organize with him this third Ontario University's Accounting and Finance Symposium. And immediately I apologized to him, saying, I'm neither in accounting nor finance, I'm in operations and supply chain management. But he said, don't worry, we won't take that against you. And so we decided to move forward with this initiative together with our partners from Brock University. And we are so very pleased that we have generated huge attendance at this symposium. I have not seen a single forum of this type here in Ontario, or even in the major academic conferences that we attend, where we're all sitting in a U-shaped configuration like this. Everyone is engaged in the discussion. And I think that it is worth considering doing this over and over the coming years, because it's a good way of bringing together our colleagues in accounting and finance and challenging everyone to think about, the research issues that need to be addressed, and continue to come up with very good work. We've had 8 presenters who have delivered their papers, and it is nice to see that 6 of these 8 are ladies. Very, very nice, very, very encouraging indeed. And once again, on behalf of the organizing committee, we thank all of the 8 presenters and all our 6 panelists. Thank you very much.